started. All right. Welcome, attendees. We're going to give folks just a little bit of time to join us before we get started. Thank you for being here right on time. All right. See some folks joining us live on Facebook as well. We're going to get started here in just a second. Give folks just a little bit more time to join. Thanks everyone for hanging in there, your patience. All right, well, I think I'll get us started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Wing. I work with the City of Portland. I'm one of the coordinators of the Fix It Fairs, which are usually in-person community resource events that, of course, for pandemic reasons, we've brought a lot of the resources online, especially with these online workshops. We do hope to be back in person at our events starting next November. So fingers crossed on that. But yeah, today we have East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District with us. Thank you so much for joining today. Really appreciate you being here. I would say take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Wing, and thank you to the Fix It Fair for having us on. I know that we'd love to be in person, but for now, glad to be in this virtual space. In this time where I'm doing a little introduction, feel free to put in the chat where you're watching from. I always think it's great to see either on Facebook Live or on Zoom where folks are tuning in from. So hi, my name is Tiffany Mancias. I'm the Community Outreach Education Coordinator for East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District. And for folks who don't know what the East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District is, we're actually a governmental organization, but we're a non-regulating body, which means we don't make laws. This organization actually grew out of the Dust Bowl when some folks didn't really know how to care for land, soil, and water. We're having a lot of issues, obviously. And so the government kind of came in and was like, we want to actually create an organization to support people and to support them with education funds and resources to have a more sustainable landscape. And so that's our organization's mission. So what we do is we provide workshops, grants, we even have a farm incubator, and the workshops are usually on topics. We've got sustainable gardening, land management, and today is actually a 1 hour short version of a longer workshop that's 2.5 hours if you want to learn more. And there's a lot of information, and I'm going to put in the link to our website if you want to look for additional resources. We have handouts available. And we also have all of the ways to join in the longer workshops online as well. So I'm going to put those links in the chat in a second here. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our contracted expert. We actually contract with experts in the field to teach on a variety of topics. And today we're really excited to have Dr. Celeste Cirales Mazzacano, who goes by Z. And Z is an entomologist and invertebrate ecologist with over 2 decades of experience in education, research, and conservation. And so with that, Z, go ahead and take it away. And thanks for joining us today.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much. And thanks as well, Wing. It's always cool to be able to go to a Fix-It fair. So I certainly look forward to having those resume in the future. So welcome everybody to this kind of highlights reel of understanding and sustaining insect pollinators in your yard. As this goes along, whether you're on Facebook or you're watching this on Zoom, please do make use of the chat box or the comments in Facebook to be able to ask questions. That's as interactive as we can get as you folks asking questions out there. And I will be pausing at intervals during the workshop to answer questions too. So, and any questions we don't have time to answer, we'll figure out a way to get those posted or, posted on Facebook or sent out to people. So don't be shy. Feel free to ask those questions. So let's jump right in. Why do people care about pollinators? Why are pollinators important? Why do you want to know anything about them? Well, they're really, really important for flowering plants, right? Because that's basically the way that plants create the next generation. Pollen is like the male sex cell, the sperm cell, and needs to be transferred either between different parts of a flower on one plant, different flowers on the same plant, maybe flowers on completely different plants that are separate from each other. And if that doesn't happen, there's no next generation. And of course, we come into this because we eat those plants, or we eat the fruits that result when there's pollination that happens, or we eat the seeds that result when the pollination happens. So basically that's what pollination is. It's a way for something that pretty much sits there in the ground and can't move around to be able to get that little granule, those pollen granules transferred. So it's really a mobility issue. And depending on the type of plant, they might need a little more help or a little bit less help. So for some things like grasses and corn and sorghum and things like that, the wind blowing is enough to be able to move that pollen around and to get the pollination achieved. But most types of flowering plants need a little bit more help than that, and they rely on some kind of animal. So that might be something like a mammal. There are bats, for example, that can be important pollinators in a little bit warmer, a little bit more tropical systems. Birds, hummingbirds, can actually be good pollinators for different types of wildflowers, but the vast majority of all flowering plants that get a little bit of help in pollination are actually relying on insects. And you might have noticed that the title of this workshop is not Understanding and Sustaining Bees in Your Garden. It's Understanding and Sustaining Insect Pollinators in Your Garden, because bees are not the only organisms that pollinate. They're not the only insects that pollinate. There's a lot of other critters out there that do this pollination activity. And you might be a little bit familiar with those, or it might come as a complete surprise to you that things like beetles and flies and moths and butterflies and thrips and a variety of different types of insects are actually able to do this pollination. And although maybe you might think, oh, well, some of these other insects, maybe they're out there and they're pollinating wildflowers, or things that aren't necessarily like as critical or as economically important. These are also important in agriculture. I mean, we in America, in the United States, we've really kind of hooked our wagon to the European honeybee that we rely on very heavily for agriculture, but a lot of these different insects can be good pollinators of a lot of pretty economically important crops, including a whole bunch of things that we also grow, for example, in the state of Oregon. So they've got some economic as well as just sort of conservation and more natural area types of importance as well. But I am going to start with the bees because bees are, I don't want to say the most important pollinators, but they're the most efficient pollinators. They're the most effective pollinators, and they come in a really huge variety of shapes and sizes and habitats and specializations and abilities. And some of them don't even necessarily look all that much like a bee. So you might not really think about insects having tongues, but they drink stuff. They lap up water, they lap up dew. If you're a bee, you're going to be lapping up nectar. And their tongue, which you see sticking out of the head of that slightly damp looking bumblebee there on the right, can be relatively shorter or longer. And that might sound like a really weird, not very useful piece of trivia to have in your head. But if you're thinking about the types of plants that you want to have, the types of flowers that can be used, that nectar and pollen can be gotten out of. It matters whether you're thinking about short-tongued bees or long-tongued bees. So they need slightly different types of resources. And then we also have bees that might be generalists, like that bumblebee on the right. And that just means that they can visit and collect nectar and pollen from a big variety of different types of plants. Now, if one particular thing is in flower, you know, if you've got like a whole bunch of apple trees, for example, in flower in your yard, you might find that the bees are, you know, coming and going a little bit more to those because that's what's there, that's what's abundant. But it doesn't mean that those bees can only use, you know, apple trees. So they might concentrate on what's in bloom at the time, but they can use a wide variety of different flowers. At the opposite end of that spectrum, we have the specialist, and the little squash bee that you see on the lower left is a super example of one of those specialists. So there are some bees that will only collect their pollen from a more narrow kind of palette or a subset of different flowering plants, and some of them will only collect it from one particular group, one particular type of flowering plant. So squash bees are super specialists. The female makes her nest at the base of the squash plants. She collects nectar and pollen from the squash plants. The male bees, who do not have a nest to go home to at night, actually sleep in the closed up flowers of the squash plant when darkness comes. So super, super, super specialized kind of bee. So there's a big range of generalists and specialists kind of in the entire world of bees. So one of the reasons that bees are so very, very effective, so very, very efficient at pollinating, is that they are designed by nature, they're designed by evolution to be able to have pollen stick to them, right? So you've probably seen a bee flying around and it looks like it has little, little saddlebags, this pollen that's packed together in these more specialized hairs that they can really collect and pack the pollen into. And for most of our different types of bees, those specialized hairs are going to be on the upper portion of the hind legs. And then for one group of bees, those specialized hairs are actually on the underside of the abdomen. But it's not just that they have those sort of more specialized hairs. Maybe if you've watched, especially a big bee like a bumblebee or even a honeybee going about its job, you might notice that as they're going in and out of flowers, sticking their tongue in, drinking the nectar, grabbing the pollen, that they get pollen stuck all over. They get it on their heads, they get it on their backs, they get it on their abdomen, they get it on their wings. And if you watch that bee long enough, you might see her start to use her legs to sort of groom herself. And what she's doing, her legs have these little barbs and combs and hooks on them, is she's grooming and moving that pollen, kind of packing it more efficiently into those more specialized pollen collecting hairs. And if you were to look at those hairs themselves under a microscope, you would see that they might look a little bit less like hairs and a little bit more like feathers. They might be branched or barbed or spiral, coiled or twisted, because the hairs themselves are designed to be sticky, to have pollen that touches them, be more likely not to fall off. And as the bees are flying around, they actually develop an electrostatic charge, a little bit like, you know, if you scuff your feet across a carpeting on a dry day and then you touch somebody, you've got this built up static electricity that can shock somebody. So they are designed, that electrostatic charge actually helps the pollen stick to their bodies as well. So the reason they are designed by nature to be such good pollen collectors is because just like if the pollen doesn't get moved from one part of the plant or one flower to another, there's no next generation for the plant. If they don't collect nectar and pollen, there is no next generation for the bees, because that is the only food that a larval bee, a baby bee in immature form, is able to eat, is the nectar and pollen that their mothers, or in the case of social bees, their sisters, are able to collect for them. Now, oftentimes, if you ask people to think about bees or name a bee, unfortunately, the sort of the poster child for bee conservation even is the honeybee. But that's actually the full name of the honeybees that we have in North America is European honeybees. So they were brought over by European colonizers hundreds and hundreds of years ago now, but they did not evolve here. And you might not think that that makes that much of a difference, but because European honeybees did not evolve with our native plants in this continent, which includes a great many different types of crops, right? Like tomatoes and tomatillos and squash plants, right? They're not necessarily the best pollinators. They're not necessarily the most efficient or the most effective, even though they are, yes, admittedly a pollinating bee. So we have over 4,000 species of native bees in North America. 4,000 species of native bees, all of them with their particular niche, the particular flowers and plants that they collect nectar and pollen from. And many of them are much more efficient at pollinating than European honeybees are, even though that's kind of the bee that we think about. That's the bee that we've concentrated on in a lot of our agricultural systems. So because these native bees evolved in this, climate where we are, wherever you happen to be on the continent, that means that they are more accustomed to the weather. And if you keep track of such things, like when you see the first big queen bumblebees flying around in the spring, because they hibernate, those queens hibernate through the winter, and then they wake up when we get a few warmish days in a row, and they start flying around looking for nectar and pollen, looking for a place to make their nest. You might notice that you can see them flying around, like sometimes in February, definitely in March. I was really kind of surprised yesterday. I was looking out at my yard, and it was still pretty chilly yesterday, even though the snow is gone. And I saw a big queen bumblebee who was nectaring and collecting pollen from some of my Oregon grape that's in flower in my front yard. I was like, damn, that's a chilly day. You're still out and about. So a lot of times native bees can be active when it's a little too cold or a little too wet for those European honeybees to be able to be out. And sometimes the way they move around from flower to flower to flower is actually more efficient. So you can use, like 10-fold fewer mason bees, for example, can effectively pollinate an entire orchard of apple trees. And you would need a great many more honeybees. And people do bring in, honeybee hives to orchards that are in bloom to be able to get the same effectiveness, the same level of pollination. And then there's some types of pollination, some types of plants that European honeybees just can't really do much of anything with at all. So there's an activity called buzz pollination that many of our different types of native bees are able to do. And it's nothing that European honeybees do, because the plants that need this buzz pollination are not plants that they evolved with. So if you think about things in the nightshade family, like tomatoes and peppers, eggplant, tomatillos, things like that, the anthers, the part of the flower that actually contains the pollen, they're made a little bit differently. Most of the time, if you look at a flower, you can see the little rough grains of pollen that are just sort of stuck on the outside of the anther. You tap it, they fall off on your finger, or you blow on it, they blow into the air. It's pretty easy to mobilize that pollen. But the plants that rely on these buzz pollinators, their anthers are a little bit more like salt shakers. And the pollen's there, but it's inside the anther. And there are these little pores in the anther. And there actually has to be a physical shaking or a vibration in order to get that pollen to flow. And in the early days, before people realized that things like bumblebees could do this, tomatoes that were grown in greenhouses were grown on shaking tables so that the pollen could be shaken loose from the flower and you'd be able to get tomatoes to harvest. So what something like a bumblebee does when they fly up to your tomato plants is they perch upside down and they hold onto the flower with their legs. And then they use the same muscles that power their wings, but they don't flap their wings. Instead, they just kind of vibrate them. It's a little bit like if you're shivering, right? Your muscles are sort of vibrating. And it's such a forcible vibration that it actually emits an audible tone. It's like a middle C sound. And if you can see the flower shake pretty violently, if you're watching this, you can hear this really strong buzzing sound. And that vibration then makes that pollen trapped inside the anthers flow through those little pores, fall down on the body of the bee, and then she can go on to the next plant, collect pollen, transfer pollen, the next plant, and so on and so forth. So this is something that European honeybees just absolutely can't do. So they're not good at all at pollinating some types of plants. The other thing is when we think about bees, because the bee that most folks are the most familiar with are honeybees, is we think about the hive, right? We think about the social bee where there's only one that's laying eggs, the reproductive female, the queen. All of her daughters are the workers. They take care of their sisters. They take care of the queen. They collect the nectar and pollen. They clean up the hive. And males males are there for mating, so they're not produced all the time, because otherwise they just hang around and chow down on the honey that's been stored. So they're produced more at the end of the year. And something like a honeybee nest can go on for many, many, many years, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 years. But the only one of our native bees that's truly a social bee is the bumblebee. And you can see that their nest looks super different from a honeybee hive. So if you look on the right there, that is a bumblebee nest that has been created. Probably she's using an abandoned like rodent nest or something like that. So a little crevice in the ground. It's kind of messy looking. And there is still wax in there, but it's not those nice, neat hexagonal honeycombs that you expect to see in a social beehive. Instead, there are little pots, little wax pots that will hold nectar and pollen and the eggs and the larvae. So that's an annual colony as well. Those bumblebee queens only live for 1 year. They don't go on year after year the way the honeybees do. And there are some of our other types of bees that have sort of a semi-social or a cooperative type of behavior. So there might be some resource sharing. There might be just one or a few females that are the ones laying eggs, but those are really the exceptions. And the vast majority of all of our native bees are solitary. What does that mean? It means that every single female is going to find a mate with one or a couple of males, and then she stores that sperm and just uses it for the rest of her life to fertilize her eggs. She's going to have to find some sort of a tunnel or a crevice or a hole that she can use as a nest, or she's going to have to dig one. And that might be chewing out the soft, pithy stem of a plant like a blue elderberry, or it might be actually using her jaws and her legs to tunnel, to dig a nest tunnel in the soil. So the reason she's got to have this nest is because she has to have some place to lay her eggs, right? It's not going to be a big hive. It's going to be whatever her nest is. So she digs these tunnels, or she finds an existing tunnel like left by a wood boring beetle or something in wood. And then she's going to excavate little openings, little cells off of that tunnel. And in every one of those little individual nest cells, she's going to deposit an egg. And then she's going to bring, collected from trip after trip after trip, when she goes out foraging, she's going to be creating a little ball or a little puddle, depending on the type of bee, that's this mixture of nectar and pollen. And when she's done with that, she seals off that cell. And when she's completely done laying all of her eggs and provisioning them with the nectar and pollen they need, she seals it up and she flies away. So she will never see her sons and daughters, right? She's got to collect enough food so that when all of her eggs hatch, each one of those little larvae, each one of those little immature bees has enough food right there to be able to consume all the way until it's ready to turn into a pupa and to then emerge as an adult bee. And then it chews its way out of that tunnel and goes about the business of creating the next generation all over again. So this is a tremendous amount of work. And most of our native bees don't ever fly more than a few hundred meters from their nest. And larger bees, like carpenter or bumblebees, could go up to a mile or so when they're flying out, when they're foraging and looking for the nectar and pollen they need to bring home. But you can see that it's really important that wherever a female decides to make her nest, it's going to be better for her, because it's risky every time she flies back and forth, and she's using a lot of energy to fly back and forth. The more resources for nectar and pollen for flowering plants that are kind of in a pretty close vicinity of her tunnel, the more efficiently and effectively she'll be able to collect enough of everything that those her offspring are going to need to be able to get from egg to adult themselves. And we have a tremendous variety of bees, and some of these common names might be a little more familiar to you, like carpenter bees or mason bees, leafcutter bees, especially because it's getting kind of popular to put out mason bee houses. And some of them you may never have heard of before, like longhorn bees or polyester bees, but we have these. We have a whole lot of these, even in our urbanized, Portland area and in the surrounding suburbs. And all they need to be able to thrive is a little bit of love and a little bit of resources. And they will be there pollinating all your plants, pollinating whatever food plants you might use. And a little bit later in this presentation, I'll talk about what some of those resources are that they need. But another thing to keep in mind is that these bees come in a huge variety of shapes and sizes and colors. You can kind of see that just from the ones that are pictured on these slides. And these are some of the larger size bees, things that are honeybee sized or maybe a little bit bigger. But you can see that some of them are stripy and some of them aren't. Some of them are metallic and some of them are more dull. They can be green, orange, red, yellow, brown, lots and lots of different colors and shapes and sizes. They can be smaller than a housefly or about the size of your thumb. So you probably have a few more bees in your yard than you might even think or know that you have, and you just sort of haven't realized it. It merits a closer look. So that's those 4,000 species of native bees is like, wow, we've got all these different pollinators out there. But there are a lot of other types of insects that are also pollinators, and they're not quite as effective, they're not quite as efficient at pollinating, because nectar and pollen for them are sort of like nutritional supplements. It's not what they necessarily rely on for food. It's definitely not what their offspring feed on. But nectar is sugar, right? So it's a good source of energy and of fluid, just of water. Pollen is a chunk of protein. So it's a really good chunk of protein. So they do better when they have nectar and pollen available to eat, but they're not quite as evolved to be really super effective pollinators, because their next generation does not depend absolutely on delivering nectar and pollen the way it is for bees. But that's not to say that they're not good at pollinating or that they're not necessary or useful as pollinators, because if you look at all the different types of flies, thrips, beetles, moths, butterflies, that's a big variety of body shapes and sizes and habits and life histories. And so they can maybe even be out pollinating at times of day or in weather where even our native bees aren't out foraging. And because they're not needing to bring nectar and pollen home to the babies, they just keep on flying around looking for food, looking for nectar, looking for pollen, hunting. Many of the beetles that feed on nectar and pollen are predatory. They can actually carry pollen across even further distances, just as they're moving around, because they're not tied to constantly going back to that nest. And that can be really good if you think about like outbreeding for plants or for extending the ranges of different plants. So two particular types of flies that you might think about as pollinators, and I can guarantee you pretty much that you probably have these in your yard at some point in the summer, are flower flies and bee flies. They are actually bee mimics, as you can see from their stripy little bodies and that fuzzy little bee fly on the lower right that's doing a pretty good job of mimicking a bumblebee. And the adults like to eat nectar and pollen, and they'll eat honeydew as well. And the larvae have nothing to do with nectar and pollen. They're either predatory in the case of the flower flies, and so they can run around at night munching up the aphids that are in your yard, or else they are parasitic on other insects. But because flies are active little flyers and they have fuzzy little bodies, they do a pretty good job of picking up pollen, and they can actually be important in pollinating some of the different crops that we grow in Oregon, like onions and mustards, as well as being able to pollinate berries. With the beetles that are pollinators, most of them as adults are predatory. So this is where having pollen as an additional source of protein, like a little energy bar, really comes in handy, because if it's a time of day or a time of year where there's not a lot of prey around, well, they can munch on some pollen and they can get energy from nectar. Big variety of different types of beetles here, fun to look for in your yard, and usually pretty brightly and really big range of size. Smaller beetles might be like maybe the size of your little finger. They hang out on the flowers, so that's a good place to be able to look for them. As I said, the larvae, totally different food source. They don't nectar at all. And then lastly, we come to the butterfly and the moths, not quite as effective or efficient as pollinators in some cases, because when they are collecting nectar, and that's what they're sipping on there as adults, they unfurl this really, really, really long tongue. And normally you don't see their proboscis because it's coiled up in a nice, neat little circle on the underside of their heads. But you can sort of see that woodland skipper, the little orange dude at the bottom, has this kind of dark tube coming out of its face. It's sipping water from the mud that it was perched on. As they're flying around and they're perching on plants to be able to sip that nectar, they can get pollen stuck to their tongue or stuck to their fuzzy, scaly little bodies. And then as they're flitting around from plant to plant to plant, they can transfer that pollen to the next plant that they visit. And remember, with butterflies and moths, the adults can fly around and sip nectar from a whole lot of different types of plants, but their caterpillars are the ones that can be much more specialized. So for example, most people know that the only kind of plant that a monarch butterfly caterpillar is able to eat is a milkweed, whereas an adult monarch butterfly can fly around and get nectar from a whole lot of different plants. It doesn't have that same restriction. And then moths, which are related to butterflies, they tend to be more active at night. They tend to be a little more dull colored, but we certainly do have some beautiful moths and some day active moths. But because they tend to be more active at dusk or in the evening, oftentimes they are pollinators of plants that bloom in the evening as well. That's that evolutionary relationship that has evolved there. And moths can be pretty important pollinators of some more tropical types of crops. And then right here in sort of more Western North America, the yucca moth on the lower left there, the only pollinator for plants in the yucca family is the yucca moth. And the only food that the caterpillars of the yucca moth can eat is the fruit of a fertilized yucca plant. So this is a super, super, super specific pollinator relationship right there. So I know, as I said, this is like the highlight reel of the critters, but before we shift gears a little bit and talk about plants and habitats and landscaping, Tiffany or Wing have any questions rolled in on either Facebook or Zoom?
I'm looking, I'm actually not seeing anything on Zoom right now. If you have a question, put it in there. If you're listening live, go ahead and put that in there. I'm not seeing anything at this moment. It looks like there's definitely some appreciation for learning. Someone said they recently saw a leaf cutter from Facebook. So we do have some interaction, but no questions as of yet. So yeah,
Okay.
So I guess you can keep going and I'll let you know next break if we see some maybe towards the end.
All right, that sounds good. So, this is the city of Portland, looking off there towards Mount Hood, and it doesn't look very hospitable, right? If you think about, wow, creating habitat, is it really worthwhile for me to even try to create habitat in my, fill in the blank, whether you have a yard, a garden, if you're more rural, if you've got a farm, if you rent, if you own, if you have window box, like whatever the case may be. Can I really like get these creatures in my yard? Am I really going to be able to use their pollination services, on that end of the deal? Or am I going to be able to provide resources that can actually help them and help maintain, their populations in this really urban area? And that's a valid question. Absolutely it is. But the cool thing is that this is how the city looks to our eyes, right? As we look out, it's just like there's glass, there's metal, there's pavement. It doesn't look very hospitable, right? But to the eyes of an insect, to the eyes of a bee or a beetle, this is what the city looks like, or what the city can look like. Remember, I said that, most of our species of native bees, the females don't go more than a few hundred meters, maybe a mile or so from their nest in their entire lifetime. And even for the other pollinators, the other insects that can fly further afield, if they have the resources that they need in a pretty small area, they're going to stay right there. Why should they leave? They got food, they got shelter, they got places to make their nests. So even if you have just a small area, or if you can't plant in the soil, you have to rely on pots and container gardening and window boxes, or if you have a community garden, whatever the case may be, you can still provide a good chunk of the resources that these critters need. And if you do it, and somebody else does it, and then another person does it, and another person does it, what you're doing is, within that sort of harsh, forbidding landscape of the city, you're creating a mosaic of softer, healthier, more natural, more welcoming places. And the more little pieces there are in that mosaic, the more connection there is from one piece to another, the closer together those little bits are. And it's easier for these critters to move around and disperse. And maybe if you move and somebody like takes out everything that you had in your yard, well, there's something that's just a little way down the street that's another nice patch of habitat. So it really does make a difference to try to maintain even these small patches of healthier habitat, more natural habitat to sustain the insects, and then everything else really that relies on the insects too. So what I want you to think about is complexity, right? A lot of the times humans, especially humans living in cities, tend to simplify. We pick just a few food crops to grow and eat. We pick just a few ornamental plants to have in our yards, right? But complexity is good, diversity is good, and you're not going to get a diversity of insects and birds and everything else that relies on those insects if you don't have a little bit of diversity in your landscape. So I say semi-natural habitat because most of us are not going to be able to go restore our yards or the areas that we have stewardship of currently to the way they were prior to European colonization, right? But we can still provide a certain amount of natural habitat, something that's not just, grass, for example, or non-native shrubs. And even beyond the nectar and pollen that something like the bees need or these other pollinators need, you're also going to be providing resources like places for them to be able to make their nests or to find their nesting areas, places for them to be able to hibernate through the winter, because these are native organisms. They don't leave, they don't fly south in the winter, they're going to stay here, maybe as eggs or as larvae or as pupae or adults, but they're going to stay here. Shelter on kind of a day-to-day basis from high winds, dry weather, from other things that are trying to eat them. They can hide out in nooks and crannies and against tree bark and shrubs, and alternative prey. So if you're a predatory beetle, for example, and you also are a pollinator because you're snacking on nectar and pollen, maybe there's kind of an explosion of aphids at one time in your yard. And the predatory beetles are like, yep, I'm on it. I'm all over these. They're eating them all up. They get those aphids under control. And it's like, well, there's nothing else here. And they're going to fly away. So if there's no more food left on the landscape and there's not a lot in flower so that they could eat nectar and pollen, they're going to fly off and they're going to look for alternative prey. But the more diverse a landscape you have from the plant end of things, the more diversity and abundance you will have in your insect community. And that means when all those aphids are gone, there's going to be some other beetles or flies or whatever it is that they can stay on the landscape and eat. So you're keeping those little workers right there in your yard because you're giving them everything that they need. And as I said, that nectar is a good way for them to get additional energy. And so there have been a lot of studies that show that even something that's not a bee that just snacks on nectar and pollen actually does better for fertility, fecundity, survival, abundance when you've got this nectar and pollen for additional resources for them. So let's say you're just starting out with this. And you're like, I'd like to be helping these critters. I'd like to have the pollinators for my plum tree or my tomatoes or my green beans or whatever you might grow. How do I go about it? So if you're just starting out, or if you do a lot of different types of gardening, I mean, I have a lot of food that I grow in my yard, for example, think about just designating maybe 10%, just a small amount to start with, of the area that you garden and putting in plants that are designed to help these beneficial insects. And again, it's all about variety and diversity. Not just, you achieve this with different types of plants, but different flower types, colors, shapes, leaf textures, plant heights, all the way from ground covers to if you can get to shrubs and trees, if your area accommodates that. And one of the most important things about diversity here is bloom time. So I said that our queen bumblebees can wake up in February and March. And even when we get into October and November, when it's getting a little bit more chilly and we maybe had some periods of rain or even snow or hail, on a warm day, it gets into the 40s and 50s and it's sunny, you're still going to see some of these critters flying around. So because one plant's not going to bloom from February through November, you need to think about things coming into bloom. And then as that bloom dies back, there's new bloom, these waves of bloom that span our very long active season. And if you can't plan a whole lot of area, or you're thinking about, well, what are some additional kind of low maintenance, easy to implement types of habitat that you can put in? One is an accessible water source. So a lot of times with as hot and windy as our summers have been, insects are going to need more and more safe access to water, because if you just have a bowl of water or a basin of water, they'll try to land on it to take a drink, but water has really strong surface tension and insects aren't that big. Stuck and they flail around and then they die, they drown. So on the lower left there, you see what I call my beneficial insect bath. So all you need is a shallow tray that you can fill halfway with gravel, sand. You can put some larger rocks in if you want to. A mixture of sand and gravel, doesn't really matter. And you snug that down in an area that's kind of got partial sun. You don't want it in deep shade or necessarily full sun where it'll just dry out real fast. And then you just add enough water to it so that that gravel or whatever it is in there is saturated. So now what you've done is you've provided this nice sort of safe basin where the insects can land, walk around, not get stuck, put their mouth parts down, get a drink, and then walk or fly away. It's going to dry out pretty quickly, but that's good. It's just shallow. You're not talking about putting a layer of water on top of the rocks, just wetting that gravel. And that means there's no standing water. So you did not just become the neighborhood producer of mosquitoes, which would probably make you very unpopular. And last, but definitely not least, is leave some patches of available soil. And I don't mean have a big patch of totally scraped off bare earth in your yard. I mean, have at least some areas that don't have, weed barrier cloth or 6, 7, 8 inches of mulch on top, lightly mulched, thinly vegetated. And you see that in the two photos, the top left and then the middle. That's not just bare earth, but I know it's really popular for people to put out mason bee houses. You can get mason bee pupa when you go to workshops, and that's exciting. It's fun to see them use that habitat. There are some issues with it that I don't have time to go into now, but I can always talk to people about later. But almost 3/4 of all of our native bees actually nest in the soil. And one of the first things that goes away when cities get constructed is available dirt, because everything gets paved over. So if you can leave some areas that are lightly mulched, maybe around the base of a shrub or in your rock garden, or just somewhere in your yard where there is some available soil, I can promise you, you will see those little round holes. You will see those little chimneys develop. That's a native bee nest on the upper left, and it's one of several dozen that I have in my rock garden right now, where I have plants and I have some mulch, but it is not so thick a layer that those little female bees can't get down to the dirt and start digging. As far as the different types of plants to sustain these different types of critters, so I've talked about the fact that native plants and native insects evolve together. And it's really, really important for a plant, a flowering plant, to be found by its pollinator or pollinators. And for that reason, plants have actually evolved to be able to be more noticeable, more attractive to whatever their pollinator is. And this is just called pollinator syndrome. It just means that the different traits that different plants have evolved make them hopefully more likely to be located by whatever it is that pollinates them. And because these pollinators are really different types of insects, from bees to flies to beetles to moths, kind of stands to reason that they may be attracted by different types of flowers. So interesting fun bit of trivia about bees is that they cannot see the color red. The visual pigments in their nice compound eyes simply don't respond to those wavelengths. So red colored flowers are not terribly noticeable to them, but purples and blues and yellows, yep, those are very commonly found in bee pollinated flowers. A light sweet scent is also often there, and nectar as well as pollen, because they need both of those. And some flowers have like more rich nectaries than others. And oftentimes the flowers that they pollinate will have little marks, streaks, speckles, rays. You can really see that on the foxgloves. You can also see it on that penstemon. Those markings aren't just decorative, they're nectar guides. And once again, those are more eye-catching, literally, to the bees that visit them. It's like a landing strip. It's like this way to the pollen, this way to the nectar. Nectar is kind of the sweet treat reward that the bees get for doing the work of pushing their way into the flower, getting that pollen and moving it to another plant. And because it is a little bit of work, bee pollinated flowers oftentimes have a sturdy enough structure that it's kind of a landing platform or a perch for the bees to move around on. And another thing that sort of helps them notice the flowers in the landscape is oftentimes bee pollinated flowers will have a lot of pointed petals. It just seems like that edge effect makes the contrast between the flower and the rest of the surrounding landscape a little bit more noticeable. And remember that we have short-tongued bees and we have long-tongued bees. So short-tongued bees are going to find it easier to get at the nectar and pollen that is in smaller, more open, more available flowers. So plants that have big clusters of small flowers. And one of the easiest ways to provide good resources for short-tongued bees, as well as for a lot of different flies and beetles, is to just have herbs and let them go to flower, let them go to seed. You could always keep like one pot for the chive that you're harvesting, you know, and one pot for the chive that you allow to flower. So I always let my herbs go flower. Doesn't make them as useful to me, but it's a really good resource for the pollinators. Little types of daisies, marigolds, phlox, you know, fleabane or rigeron, like our seaside daisy. That's another really good thing for the short-tongued bees. Now, longer tongue bees, they can stick that tongue into more tubular, trumpet-shaped flowers. So foxglove, of course, which is not native, but it's a volunteer in my yard and I love it, so I leave it. But native plants like penstemon or monkey flower, lupin, I get so many bumblebees on my lupin. They absolutely love it. And you can see they're on my penstemon as well. Those long-tongued bees can make use of those deeper flowers that a short-tongued bee couldn't really use. Now, beetles are actually, in evolutionary terms, one of the earliest pollinators, at least as far as we know on the fossil record, that arose on the planet. And the plants that are beetle pollinated are what you might think of as sort of not more primitive, but simpler, more structurally simple. So kind of a simple bowl or an easily accessible spike. Remember that a lot of the beetles that act as pollinators are predators, so they're really interested in the protein. They want the pollen. So the plants don't necessarily need to put much energy into making nectar to be attractive to their beetle pollinator. It's a pollen that they want to consume, and of course, some of it will get stuck to their bodies. So beetle pollinated flowers tend to be kind of dull as far as color is concerned, but the odor is a little bit stronger, and that might be pleasantly fruity or spicy to our noses, or it might be kind of a bad smell. As I said, they're a bowl or a spike shape, may not even have any nectar. And so things like asters, tulip trees, roses, our native roses have a much simpler type of petal structure, goldenrods and spireas. Those could be super attractive to beetles. Flies, they're little dudes as well. So a lot of the things that will be attractive or beneficial for the shorter tongued bees, the flies can use those too. Color is not necessarily all that appealing, but kind of a funky odor. I mean, flies will be flies after all. So if you think about elderberry or skunk cabbage, that can be appealing to a fly, but small available flowers. The red trillium that you see there, that's an eastern trillium, but it's one of those examples of a really, really bad thing that's appealing to a fly. So another name for that is stinking Benjamin. And it smells like rotting meat. And that's appealing if you're a fly. So some people say that the little red petals even look like chunks of meat, which I think is a little bit of a stretch, but a funkier odor can be more appealing, more attractive, make that flower found more easily by a fly. Butterflies, like composite flowers, things they can generally perch on, variety of colors. Most of them will land, so they need a perching platform so that they can put that tongue down. Again, kind of a light, sweet scent, and you can see a few examples there among our native plants, things like manzanitas, milkweeds, serviceberry, currants. There's a lot of different types of flowers that they will actually feed on. Now, moths, remember I said a lot of those are active in the evening. And so if you want to be found by your pollinator and it's dark out, one good way to do that is to be very, very pale and or to have a really, really, really strong smell. So if you see something that's blooming in the evening or the late afternoon, and it has that knock you between the eyes, overwhelmingly strong, sweet smell, like jasmine, for example, or honeysuckles or primroses. And then I talked about the yucca moths. It might also be very pale colored. This is going to be characteristic of a moth pollinated flower. So talked about this already. You want that long bloom time, diversity. I don't only have native plants in my yard. I have some ornamentals. I have food plants, but remember, native insects evolve with native plants. They do better on native plants, and they're better for your water bill and your pocketbook because native plants are really easy to propagate. So you can get cuttings and divisions from people in your area. They are adapted to our cold, wet winters and springs and our hot, dry summers. So you're not going to be pouring water on them all the time to try to coax them into not dying. And when you're starting out, you're probably going to start small. You know, nobody can afford to go out and be like, I'm going to get 50 goldenrod plants and 22 currants, right? So if you're starting and you're just like, oh, I'm going to buy 3 or 4 goldenrod, 3 or 4 aster, 3 or 4 pearly everlasting, you want to plant them more in clusters, in drifts, because again, that makes it more obvious to the eyes of the bee or the fly or the beetle, and it makes it a little bit easier for them to find. So this idea of bloom throughout the season, I'm going to run through this really quickly because I'm getting a little short on time. This is just to sort of show you that there's a huge variety of different types of plants out there. And just by kind of figuring out what the growing conditions are in your yard, whether it's wet or dry, sunny or shady, that you can get this diversity of bloom, and you sort of, it's built in that if you have some plant diversity, you'll also get that diversity of flower type, structure, plant height, leaf texture, and you can see that even just from the plants here that are shown on the screen, which are just a few of the ones that would flower in early spring. So we've got everything from the lower growing wildflowers or ground covers like oxalis and candyflower that come on early in the spring, ground covers like kinnikinnick, and then you sort of move on to the next canopy level, if you want to think of it that way, to the forbs and the wildflowers like spring beauty and fawn lilies and trilliums, on into the shrubs like twinberries and dogwoods and currants, all the way up to things like willow and osaberry trees. So you've got all these different potential canopy layers. Later in the spring, more of our wildflowers come into bloom, and they're just, you know, camas and iris, checker mallow. We've got just beautiful, beautiful, all different colors and hues and heights and textures that come into bloom as spring is continuing, as I trust spring will start to continue. Summertime, we've got tons of different types of native milkweeds and roses and berries like twinberry, snowberry, thimbleberry, salmonberry. Beautiful, beautiful, hardy, easy to grow plants. Shrubbier types of wildflower plants like the milkweeds and the lupins that can get kind of hefty. Tough, hardy, sun-loving, drought-tolerant plants like Oregon sunshine, you know, and cinquefoil. So huge, huge variety. The palette shrinks a little bit when you get into late summer and fall. And a lot of the stuff that used to bloom in the fall, like goldenrod and aster, with climate change in the 14 years I've lived here, are now blooming a lot earlier in the summer. But California fuchsia and pearly everlasting are very, very reliable late season bloomers. So is my sedum. We have a variety of different native sedums. And even if the goldenrod and aster bloom a little earlier, they hang on to those flowers for a long time as the season progresses. And then in wintertime, you still need to think about your yard, your garden as a habitat. And a lot more organizations are starting to put out this leave the leaves message. Don't rake it all up in the fall. Don't cut it all back, because you just spent the spring, summer, and fall creating a beautiful 5-star resort for all of those local beneficial insects. And if when October, November comes, you cut all that to the ground and you rake it all up and you toss it out, you've basically just let everybody go to bed after they checked into that 5-star hotel, and then you burned it to the ground because they're still going to spend the winter there. So wait until you get in springtime about 4 days, 3 or 4 days in a row where the high temperature is at least like 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That's going to be the signal for all these critters to start waking up. That's when you can start, you know, putting the garden to bed, cutting back all the old stuff and making room for the new. And I will say that although a lot of times people they want to rush to the end goal, right? They want to see these critters in their yards. They want to make sure that they're there and they're going to go out and buy them. That's not the best idea. There's not a lot of regulation in the insect trade. It is very easy to buy non-native species that are not good for our natives, that can outcompete them. It is very easy to buy insects that may be transmitting diseases. And remember, some of these are predators. You know, you might buy an egg case that has, you know, 200 little praying mantis, for example, that'll hatch out of it, but they aren't really going to survive, and they're not going to stick around if there's not enough food for them to eat. You may be purchasing mason bee pupae, but if you don't have the right habitat and the right housing for them, they're not going to be able to survive. So, you know, the field of dreams, if you build it, they will come. It is much better to just create the habitat to sustain the species that are on the land. And if you run into issues with pests, don't just reach for the squirt bottle. You know, pests they have outbreak years. Sometimes aphids aren't so bad, and some years with climate conditions, oh my God, there's aphids all over the place, or flea beetles, or codling moths, or whatever. So there are a lot of different ways that you can control pests that do turn into problems in your yard. And that's called integrated pest management. And there's sort of four main legs to the integrated pest management table. I guess I can use that metaphor. And when you're putting in this habitat that sustains pollinators, a lot of that habitat is going to sustain different types of insects that are natural enemies that can prey on the aphids, the whiteflies, the mites, the caterpillars that might be munching on your plants. Think about what you're planting, you know, the right plant in the right place. That's a really good way. If you have a strong, healthy, sturdy plant, it actually has better pest resistance. So there are cultural control methods where you can just reduce the conditions that are needed for a pest to establish. You can use something like floating row covers to prevent pests from being able to actually access your plant. You can put down copper strips at the edges of your raised beds to repel the slugs that might want to come and munch on your plant. So physical control, physically pick off the pests that you see on your plant or hose the aphids off. That's a very effective way to control a lot of pests. And sometimes, yes, you may turn to those chemical controls, but make sure that you are not just automatically reaching for that, or that you do wait until you have a pest issue. Because if you can go organic or just reduce the amount of pesticides you use, you're going to have a more balanced, healthier ecosystem. And you're never going to get rid of those pests. They will always come back. So reducing or eliminating pesticide use using this integrated pest management, it's better for the water health, it's better for your health, your pet's health, the wildlife health, and it's not that hard to do. Because even when you use pesticides according to the labels, there's a lot of research out there showing that things like pollinators, things like beneficial wasps and beetles that can control pests in your yards, they're actually more sensitive to them. And pests are pests for a reason. They're designed to move into an area, establish quickly, and reproduce like gangbusters. So they can recolonize many times a lot faster after a pesticide application than these beneficial insects can. And there's a lot of work out there. I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that a lot of our pollinator declines, especially for the bees, are related to overuse of pesticides or pesticide use during bloom periods. So you may find that you've got more problems, more pests in your yard after you use a lot of pesticides, because the natural enemies that were controlling some of the other pests and keeping their numbers under control, they're gone now. And so they're going to take longer to come back. And you can also do a lot of damage just to sort of the general health of these pollinators and other beneficial insects. It makes sense. If you're chronically exposed to a poison, you're not going to be able to find mates or forage for food or go from egg to adult quite as well. So there are pesticides out there that are approved for organic systems. There are ones that are more targeted, ones that you can use for spot treatments, insecticidal oils, or soaps, baits that use a pheromone or an odor to bring something like a codling moth, for example, into a sticky trap. Know what the pest is, where it's a problem, when it's more vulnerable. And the good thing is you can find a lot of these at your local nurseries. It's not hard to find these a little bit more environmentally friendly types of pesticides. And I promise you, overall, if you can make even a small patch of healthy, diverse habitat, if you build it, these creatures are out there. You know, I'm not some magical insect whisperer to have all these things in my yard. I just provide a nice diversity of habitat that doesn't have a bunch of toxins in it, and they're there. So I want to just really quick run through some different types of resources that you can explore if you're interested. A fairly recent book, The Field Guide to Pacific Northwest Insects, is a good thing to have in your hand as you're walking around your yard, maybe with your phone camera in one hand and a glass of beer or wine in your others. Integrated Pest Management for Gardeners, that's another really good guide, and Garden Insects of North America. That addresses both pests, pollinators, and other beneficial insects. It shows the type of feeding damage. Maybe you see a damaged plant, but you don't see the culprit on it. Really useful reference to have. If you want to learn more about bees, The Bees in Your Backyard is an absolutely wonderful book. I promise you, even if you know nothing about insects, you will find the bees in your backyard to be an absolutely riveting and very understandable and engaging book. And then take advantage of the fact that we live in a state, or if you think about Washington and California as well, states that have land-grant universities, because that means that we have an extension program. And that means that there's a lot of free resources out there for you to download and use. So gosh, enhancing urban and suburban landscapes to protect pollinators. That's a pretty relevant resource. And as you're thinking about planting in your yard, Google Portland plant list or native plants for Willamette Valley yards. These are, especially the Portland plant list, amazingly comprehensive resources as you are planning your garden. It tells you the growth, the moisture, the sun, the shade, when the bloom time is it attractive to butterflies, to birds, to bees. It's like the Bible of native plants. And it also has a really useful list of noxious weeds that you are going to want to avoid or pull out of your yard. OSU Extension also trains master gardeners. They're always hanging out at farmers markets. You can also use their Ask an Expert function. This is free online. There's a lot of different fact sheets that you can use. And as Tiffany mentioned, there are more and more extensive workshops through EMSWCD, all of them free. You can investigate those and sign up for them. And I don't think Lydia has done her edible landscaping one yet for the Fix It Fair. I think that one is still coming.
Yes, that's going to be on the 20th of April. And we actually have one question, Celeste, if you want to take a quick minute to answer it.
This is pretty much it. I urge you all to, I hope you have some ideas that are sparked by this, and, go forth and garden. The sun's going to come back at some point. So yeah, I'll take any questions that came up. And then, if there's something that occurs to you later, if you have some additional questions or stuff that I didn't really have time to expand on here, my email is up there. I never mind if people reach out to me. So thanks very much for being here with us today. I hope that you were interested, engaged, that you got some good ideas, and that at the very least, you have a little bit more love for some of the insect kind that's also sharing your living spaces.
Celeste, thank you so much. We have a lot of appreciation and comments about loving the content, being really excited about it. One quick question that someone had was that they own chickens and they let them free range, and they're concerned about the destructive tendencies of the chickens on the habitat for pollinators. And they had a question regarding that.
It's funny because those chickens can also be good pest control, right? Pecking up stuff. That's valid, especially in the kind of spring and early summer when a lot of those ground nesting bees are active. And it's great that you're actually thinking about the good of both of those, the free range chickens and the survival of the pollinators. I guess what I would say is, most people don't have like gigantic flocks of chickens in their yards, even in Portland. So, it might not be a huge pressure on the landscape. I would urge you, right now and in the coming weeks, kind of just explore some of the different areas in your yard and take a look to see if you maybe see some of these little bees going back and forth. I figured out that there was a native bee nest kind of right where I was weeding in my rock garden because a female bee was fussing at me, and they're not really likely to sting you, but I could tell she wasn't happy. So I sat back on my heels and she just went right down at the base of one of my plants. So do a little observation, maybe between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. on a warmer, sunnier day, a little bit than we have now. Look for nest holes or look for bee activity. And then if you see some areas where you've got bee nests, because oftentimes where the soil is the quality that they want, where the sun exposure is good to warm them up early in the day, even though they're not social, they might still, you might still have multiple females all making their nests in the same area. If you see some areas like that, if you can sort of, fence them off or just kind of keep that protected from the chickens. And it doesn't have to be for the entire season because the females are active, kind of like bird species. Different species of bees are active at different times of the season. And when you notice that there's a little less activity or the edges of the tunnels look sort of crumbled, like they're not being maintained, you could open that back up and let the chickens into that area as well. So maybe selective exclusion, I think, would be the short, sweet answer to that.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for answering that question. The chickens plus pollinators, there's always a way. Someone did ask a question regarding land grant education, and I just wanted to share. I put a link in the chat if you're curious about land grant and information with East Multnomah Water Conservation District. I don't know, Celeste, if you have any more information on that topic that you would add, maybe regarding pollinators and grants. I'm a little bit, I don't know too much more about what they're looking for, but thought I would just share that with you.
Let me hit escape. So is that a question in the chat box?
Yeah, it's just literally says land grant education. So I put a link in there to East Multnomah's programs, but I want to just throw it out in case you know of something else. Yeah.
Yeah, so like for the land grant university part, they run classes if you want to become a master gardener. I went through a master gardening program in Missouri before I lived here, so I have not done it recently. I don't know how often they teach those classes. I don't know like what kind of fee is involved, but if you just go to Oregon State University website and in the search box put in master gardener program, you can get information about that, and you can also get to the sites where you can do like ask the expert online. You can upload questions or photos if that was the aspect that the person was interested in as well.
Great, thank you. I think that covers it, and I'm just putting a link in there to at least the basic site of the extension program at OSU, so folks can check that out. So thanks for sharing that. And yeah, that's all the questions that we have right now. And I just want to say once again, every time I watch you, I learn something new. So I just want to say thank you. It's so exciting. And yeah, I really appreciate your time and for Fix It Fair for having us on.
Yeah, thanks much, folks. See you in the garden.
Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.